Hi guys, welcome back to another episode on Raincourt Reptiles. Today I'm going to be talking about the crested gecko. If you like these talks, please leave a like, subscribe, comment down below maybe on next video's theme. Maybe give me an idea for another animal you'd like to see in this series. And today we're going to be talking about one of the most popular reptiles in the reptile community, and that is the crested gecko. Cresteds have really cemented their place simply because they are a very hardy tropical species of gecko that do very well in captivity. They do so well, in fact, that we were able to produce meal replacements for them that basically only need water. These geckos are very hardy, easy to take care of, and they really don't need too much. Now, these geckos were first thought to be extinct. However, in the 90s, a group of scientists found a population of them in New Caledonia, and they were very quickly brought into captivity, bred, and they bred so well that, well, they quickly became a staple in our community. Now, crested geckos themselves get around to 8 inches head to tail, so they're a pretty smaller to medium sized gecko. They're a far cry from size compared to something like a Leachianus. However, they're still a pretty good handleable size. They're very soft. They have nice toe pads that they're able to climb glass on. The toe pads have a little claw at the end to help them cling onto branches. They're very mild tempered. They really don't bite. However, they do jump. You know, they kind of they do the cat thing where they kind of position themselves and then they leap. It's pretty darn cool. If you want an animal that's a little more involved, crested geckos are probably where it's at. These geckos are, above all, one of the most accessible animals you can probably get your hands on in the reptile community. So let's talk about them. And let's talk about the barriers to entry for these guys, which is environmental, spatial, and financial. For the environmental barriers, it's set at a pretty low bar. Temperature, they like ambient temperature. If your room doesn't hit the high to mid 80s, you're perfectly fine. These guys really don't require too much heat. For humidity, they like it in the 70s, which can be perfectly obtainable, and it's not an exaggerated number. It's not ridiculously humid. So that's why it gets a pretty low entry on that barrier. For spatial, as always, it's always better to give bigger enclosures to your animals, right? It's almost, a thing on the internet. You need to give bigger enclosures. However, when you're talking about minimums, which people hate to listen or agree to, the minimum size for an adult crested gecko would be a 12-inch by 12-inch by 18-inch tall enclosure. Since this is an arboreal gecko, they like taller enclosures, which probably work out better for most people, because if you have a desk, you can have several of these enclosures lined up, since they don't take up too much desk space since they're taller. So you can have one enclosure right next to the other, which is pretty cool. And for the financial, crested geckos, like most popular reptiles in the community, are fairly cheap because there's just so many people breeding them. And that is because crested geckos, like leopard and more ball pythons, have a lot of different morphs you're able to buy. I know there's things like lily whites, super reds, very dark morphs that look almost black, exanthic. There's a lot of different cool looking morphs for these crested geckos, and because of that, the base morph, or the standard, the OG wild type crested gecko, comes out to be pretty inexpensive. You can probably get yourself a baby crested for around $60. Below $100 is probably where most of the time they're at, which is pretty inexpensive. However, most of the budget that you're going to be getting is going to be going towards your setup, because these guys, like I said, are prime candidate to introduce you to the tropical bioactive side of the reptile community, which is a very beautiful beautiful side of the community where people replicate rainforest type enclosures, and these crested geckos are perfect for that type of setup. And so that type of setup might be pretty costly and pretty pricey. However, if you're looking for an animal that doesn't cost too much and the setup is fairly cheap as well, you can probably put these guys in a very good retrofitted plastic bin as well. Of course, you can have a tropical setup, a bioactive setup in a bin as well. However, you won't be able to see it. And most people, when they create these nice bioactive setups, they at least want to see. However, if you don't mind it and you only really care about your reptiles' well-being and you don't care about seeing it too much, then you can have a plastic bin, as long as it's retrofitted correctly with ventilation and heating and all that good stuff. So let's talk about the setup. Let's say you want to pick up a crested gecko next weekend. You want to have a setup up and running before you get that gecko. First of all, your enclosure that you're going to get, most of the time people get Exoterras because they're very nice, front opening, very, you're able to show your animal off better. However, you're also able to retrofit a plastic bin, like I said. Now, what you put into the setup is completely up to you. You can get an Exoterra, put paper towel on the bottom or sphagnum moss or whatever, have, tall fake plants, have a food dish there for the food, for their food, a water dish, and mist them once daily. That'll be perfectly fine. And of course, you need to have heat. You might need a heat lamp, perhaps where you live. So fairly inexpensive setup if you want it to be inexpensive. However, there are a couple things you do need. Like I said, you need climbing decorations that are tall. You don't want things that are too compact or grow too compactly. You want your animal to be able to, jump through your enclosure just fine and not have anything too thick that they might get themselves stuck on or get their tear their skin on or scales. So taller, more twiggy decorations or plants would be better. For food dishes, they do need a food dish. They don't require an insect-proof food dish. They just require something like a lid or little cup. They really don't need an insect feeder dish, and for good reason. We'll get into that in the husbandry. For heating, if you live in a very cold area where it gets below the 70s, you might want to give them a low wattage heat bulb. Not too high wattage because this might burn your gecko. However, a nice low wattage heat bulb, strategically placed where your crest is able to go and lay down and bask under it and warm up a little bit. These guys are nocturnal. They do not need UVB. However, it's always nice to offer it to them because though it's not scientifically proven that it's a definitely best thing that you can give them, it is always a good option to give an animal, right, for them to bask and at least get some UVB rays. Like is the water dish. These guys really don't need water dishes. They like to drink water droplets from the foliage of plants and sides of enclosures. So if you do have a water dish in your enclosure, that's mostly just to keep the humidity higher. That's probably what I would do. However, you really don't need a water dish as long as you're properly misting. That's pretty much all you need. If you are going the bioactive planted route, which I recommend you do and try out at least, you're probably going to need a plant grow bulb. You can get these cheaply from Amazon or Walmart or wherever, and that's just for the plants and your setup health, right? The plants enclosure health. Now let's talk about husbandry. Crested geckos are a pretty hardy tropical gecko, plain out. These guys, nowadays, thankfully, the community has produced ready meal replacement powdered diets for these guys. As a staple food, you can go out, buy yourself a big bag of Crested gecko diet, whether from Pangea or Apache or whatever company. You're able to buy yourself a big bag, and all you need is water, and this works as a staple diet for crested geckos. Now, of course, once weekly, you might want to diversify and give them something like crickets or dubia roaches to at least give them some variety. However, the staple diet is basically a simple to get, readily available powder. Nothing easier, no mess, no fuss. However, sometimes crested geckos, they get into that diet and they like it so much and they splatter it all over their enclosure. However, that's your problem. So the food thing isn't really a big thing with crested geckos. It's readily available, very easy. However, usually I would recommend you dust your feeders with like calcium or vitamins. However, because your diet that you're going to be giving your crested gecko already comes with those things, you might be overdosing your crested gecko with these things. Of course, if you only give your feeders once a week, like crickets and dubias once a week, you powdering your crickets and dubias with this extra supplements might not be an issue. However, if you give too much, then it might eventually become an issue. So you want to be very careful on how much you're supplementing their vitamins and calciums and all that good stuff. Now, for handling these guys, like I said, this species is a very good handling species for responsible hands. Crested geckos don't really bite. They chirp and they jump and they're very interactive and they're very cool. However, sometimes they drop their tails. And it could be because you grabbed onto the tails and it's your fault and you shouldn't do that. Or maybe it was because your crested gecko got startled. Loud noise, maybe there was some sudden movement and the crested gecko just dropped its tail. With most geckos, they keep a lot of their calories, fats they pump those fats, nutrients into their tails like a shed or a reservoir. However, crested geckos really don't do that, right? Leopards and fat tails, they do that. They have nice, big, chunky tails. So those guys really don't really give up their tails unless someone tugs on them hard or there's a predator. Cresteds don't do that. They have like really nice, long, slender tails, and they have no real amount of calories in that tail. So I believe that they're more willing to drop their tails. They're more not notoriously willing to drop them simply because they don't have calories in those tails. They don't have a fat reserve in their tails. So they're more likely to drop. And the bad part is, or a good part, is that these tails don't grow back. Now, I personally believe that a crested gecko without a tail is perfect, right? I think that a crested gecko that loses its tail loses about 1% of its appeal, right? It's not a big thing because crested geckos, you might go to sleep one day and your crested gecko might have a tail. You wake up and they won't have one. That's just how they roll. However, because they don't regrow a tail, usually when a gecko regrows their tail, it's often misformed. It doesn't quite look right. It doesn't look as good as its original tail. And I think because crested geckos don't regrow that odd looking tail, I think that makes them a little better because once that tail is off, you don't have to worry about something odd coming out of your gecko. Of course, some people might disagree. However, I think it's a better alternative than getting a weird looking tail to grow back. And of course, these crested geckos really don't need their tail. They just, they're really not going to suffer from not having it. So let's go over the big umbrella of the crested geckos. Let's talk about some cons. First of all, they need daily mistings. They need to be misted daily, so for them to drink up their water. They really don't do water dishes, so you got to make sure that you mist enough for them to get enough water. You mist enough that humidity is high enough. However, you don't want to mist too much and have your tank waterlogged, or mist too much and risk having your gecko develop fungal or mold in the tank, or even other types of skin infections. You want to make sure that you have proper misting and you have proper ventilation. So you gotta make that this goes true with any tropical species, right? So you want to make sure you keep an eye on that. Next is you have to be very careful when you're handling these guys, simply because of their tails. You're able to buy a specimen that already lost its tail, so you don't have to worry about it. However, if you do buy an animal that does have a tail, you want to be very careful you don't accidentally grab their tail, more so than probably any other gecko species. Obviously, they don't grow back. However, if it's lost, it's lost. And that's right about it. That's pretty much all of the cons. Cresteds are known to be very good pets, and that's for a good reason, right? They're very good with handling. Of course, you gotta make sure that whoever's handling them is responsible with them. You don't really want to give them to a child, because these are small geckos. As with always, you want to make sure that whoever's holding them is responsible enough. Their diet is extremely easy. Basically a powder and some insect feeders in the weekend. Very easy, straightforward. You can even experiment a little bit with the different types of diets available. You can give them rapashi, you can give them Pangea, and they sell different flavors too. Maybe your crested gecko likes banana, or likes guava, or likes watermelon. You know, there's different things that you can give to your crested gecko to diversify what it's eating in a very nice, simple, and available way. And lastly is that these guys are pretty hardy, and they're a tropical species, so they're a great introduction to a tropical bioactive setup. If done correctly, you'll have a beautiful gecko and an even more beautiful enclosure. It's a great door opener to great things, right? This is one of the geckos that I think can get you hooked on not just an animal, but the enclosure itself. I know a lot of people produce beautiful looking dart frogs enclosures, morning gecko enclosures. It's a great door opener for anybody. So in closing, this is a very manageable gecko. It's a tropical gecko that doesn't require too much. It is a staple in the community for a reason. Its hardiness, its simplicity to keep. It doesn't demand too much of you. It demands, some daily care with mistings and checking over the enclosure. However, that's a deal for what this animal can offer you, right? It can offer you, a very nice, beautiful animal. It can open doors for you for another hobby, having very beautiful terrarium. So this gecko, I think, above all, really offers you a whole lot more, right? With ball pythons, they can offer, a very nice setup as well, semi-arid setup. However, because these crested geckos belong to a more tropical background, you're able to do a lot more. Your imagination is basically the limit with their enclosures. And that is, I think, one of the best parts. Of course, you're able to make pretty cool looking arid and desert setups as well. However, I think with tropical, you just have more choice. Alright, so guys, so this has been the Crested Gecko. If you like these videos, leave a like, subscribe, comment down below on maybe a suggestion for next video's theme. As always, thanks for coming by and watching. Thanks for listening. And as always, I'll catch you guys in the next one. Thank you.